Welcome everyone. Bienvenidos, bienvenidos. We're just going to be starting in a few minutes, letting everyone arrive in the session. Thanks for joining us. Just wait another minute or two and then get started. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us. Welcome, bienvenue, bienvenidos. We're going to start off with some instructions from our language justice team on interpretation access.
Welcome. We're going to be interpreting simultaneously this seminar into two different languages. I'm going to start with Spanish. Tenemos a este seminario siendo interpretado de manera simultánea. Favor de buscar la función de interpretación en la barra de navegación del Zoom, en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Una vez seleccionado el idioma, salga y continuará escuchándola en ese idioma durante el resto de la sesión. Si usted se está conectando a través de una tableta o de un celular, por favor de dirigirse a la parte de los 3 puntos en donde saldrá un menú y usted podrá hacer la selección del idioma en español. Asegúrese de finalizar su selección antes de salir de esa sección. Muchísimas gracias.
Bonjour et bienvenue à ce webinaire. Afin de choisir la fonction d'interprétation sur un ordinateur, vous sélectionnez l'option Interprétation dans le menu situé en bas de votre fenêtre de Zoom. Si vous êtes sur un téléphone ou une tablette, vous sélectionnez les 3 petits points du menu Plus, puis sélectionnez Interprétation linguistique dans votre application Zoom. Merci.
Thank you, Mayra. Thank you, Camille. Welcome all. We're just going to start off with an introduction to the series, and then an overview of our topic about digital justice today that Gopal will be giving. And then we're going to be moving into our session, into the content with our 3 brilliant speakers. So this seminar series around global just transitions, kind of hosted by CS Fund and our partners at Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project. It came about as a response to our grantee partners of grassroots and movement organizations around the world, asking for more political education around just transitions and different applications of just transitions. So we've had 4 sessions so far. The first was on different interpretations of just transitions. Again, we emphasize speakers from the global majority all over the world, and then a diversity of areas of work, practices, so on and so forth. The second session was on applications of community governance and different innovations that grassroots organizations employ all over the world for decades, generations, centuries, again, that conserve the majority of the world's biodiversity, that grow the majority of the world's food, and are really responsible for so many of the functions that all of us are able to enjoy as a global society. We really emphasize the role that grassroots communities and social movements that are accountable to those communities really mobilize for transformation and for our approach to joy, justice, belonging, and liberation. This session is focusing on digital justice. As we do with all of the themes that we cover, we have a political analysis that looks at the industry, looks at the areas, and not just the application. So just like the energy sector, just like the food sector, and the industries that mobilize those sectors and actualize those sectors, the technology sector is no different. And so we're going to be taking a look at applications at the sector itself in a broader context, and relating to social justice and ecological justice. Our 3 speakers for today, I'm just going to give brief bios, and then we have a different format today than previous sessions. We're going to have a more conversational style with 3 very different voices, but very aligned worldviews and understandings of where digital and technologies play in broader society. So we have Anita Gurumurthy, the Executive Director for IT for Change in India, Barbara Nitambirueki from ETC Group based in Uganda, and Sasha Costanza Chok from One Project and Northeastern University based here in the States. And we're going to start with an overview and a framing from where we're coming from, and I'll hand it over to my comrade Gopal Dayaneni from Movement Generation, Justice and Ecology Project.
That's a classic. Forgetting to unmute. Hello, friends. Welcome to our seminar series. Before I do my framing, I want to begin by recognizing my friends and comrades at ETC Group, with whom I've had the great privilege to partner to be on staff with amazing people like Barbara and Veronica and Jim, who are on the call, and to return now to the board where I serve now with Anita, who's also one of our presenters today. So much of the framing draws on our collective approach developed over many years. And so I just want to honor ETC Group as we begin. As we enter into a conversation about digital justice, we want to begin by offering some framing that sets digital justice in the larger context of the politics of technology. We often make the mistake of thinking that technologies are simply tools to solve problems. Technologies are more fundamentally tools to transform social and ecological relationships with and for some purpose or purposes, and they are expressions of a complex set of relationships of resources and power over time. They are the embodiment of socio-ecological processes from the point of conception, long past the end of their useful lives. Technologies are never neutral. They are designed, developed, and deployed in a geopolitical environment. Technologies, from old mechanical technologies like the bicycle or the car to newer digital technology platforms like Google Cloud, are a product of who designed them, the incentives and motivations under which they were developed, and the power dynamics of how, where, and why they are deployed. Divorcing the technology applications, which we might find useful in some moments, like this Zoom communications platform, from the systems and power dynamics that they are built from, continues to cede public goods and the commons to private interests. We see this in the old mechanical technologies like the tractor. The great civil rights hero Bayard Rustin documented in the 1950s how the powerful white supremacist network, the Citizens Council, used machines like the tractor, the mechanical cotton picker, and more drastically reduced the revenue of Black farmers and dispossessed and displaced nearly 200,000 African Americans from farmlands in the Mississippi and the US South. Over the past century, 90% of the land that Black farmers owned has been lost, or more accurately, taken from them, with these technologies being an enabler of that displacement and dispossession. A modern example of how powerful interests use technology to extract from the marginalized communities is how artificial intelligence, or AI applications, are used by the Israeli occupying forces in the genocide in Gaza to search for specific people, identify targets, and then verifies if the suspect is located, where the suspect is located through an application disturbingly known as Where's Daddy? These tools are designed to tolerate extremely high death tolls and simultaneously abdicate responsibility for the decisions. On the environmental side, there's been wide coverage of the large energy and water consumption required by the massive data centers that drive AI and other computational technologies in the data economy. What's less reported are the large quantities of critical and transitional materials that digital technologies require. The same minerals required for the renewable energy economy that are often extracted from indigenous communities across the world without their consent, including here in North America. Contrast this with old water technology systems in indigenous and traditional cultures, where the design, development, and deployment happen within a community that allows for a self-governed water commoning that the late economist Elinor Ostrom described as flourishing. So what would a digital commons for the public good look like, both in terms of what it is and what is in the commons, and what are the processes of governance? How would they be designed, developed, and deployed? Who owns them? And how are the governance practices of free, prior, and informed consent and community self-determination applied? And at what scales? As society and as social movements, we have a tendency to discuss whether a technology is good or bad, such as genetically modified seeds or electric cars, and whether it works or doesn't work at the thing it claims to do, such as artificial intelligence, blockchain, big data, and all the hype of all these digital technologies. We also have historically focused on equitable access to high leverage technologies, such as the internet. How do we create equity and inclusion in access, and privacy and protections in use? And while these are important questions, they can leave out a whole set of other critical questions and push us to accept dominating narratives that advance corporate concentration, platform supremacy, and quote unquote false solutions. This is not to say that there are not more and less legitimate uses of a technology. We actively use platforms to organize, for education, and to build relationships, or that we do not need regulatory frameworks such as net neutrality. Also, we recognize the importance of rights-based interventions when working to protect people from the excesses of corporations and oppressive regimes. Well, what we come back to and will continue to do throughout this session is to continuously recognize larger geopolitical power dynamics that drive the technology industry and its practices. We invite you all here and your networks to interrogate the complex relationships of power over multiple dimensions, including space and time. We recognize that domination, exploitation, and colonization are qualities of power, but also are cooperation, care, and consent. We finish with these set of questions that can be a part of this type of inquiry. What relationships of power are required to bring a technology into being? What relationships of power are they built on? What particular labor relationships, resource relationships, and community relationships? What relationships of power are built in, locked in, or extended by a technology? What relationships of power are presumed or assumed to be necessary? What relationships of power are disrupted? What assumptions is a technology built in, and what assumptions are they built on? What practices, techniques, or technologies does it replace? Are people being de-skilled or re-skilled, and to what end and to whose benefit? So we leave you with those questions as part of our larger conversation, and our amazing panelists are going to speak to their specific experiences with all of these ideas and concepts. So thank you very much for joining us. I'll pass it back to you, Samir.
Thank you so much, Gopal. And deep appreciation for the critical analysis and the broader perspective for how we need to be engaging in these discussions, in how we design, deploy, and develop these technologies. And we'll put those sets of questions in across the different languages that we're translating in our follow-up email. So I just want to bring in Anita, Barbara, and Sasha. And we'll start off with our kind of first prompt to take us through the dialogue. And also, if there are reactions to kind of what was presented as well, please feel free to put those in. I'll just note on your screens. So Barbara's calling in from Uganda, and because of the quality of the internet, something that I think will be discussed in our conversations around digital redlining in some ways as well. She's going to be off video, and so Zoom spotlighting, I don't think spotlights non-video participants, which is why she might not be in our kind of quartet here in video, but obviously very much so in audio. So I'll start off with the first prompt. I'm pulling in from what Gopal just said. So the impacts of any technology are determined by the geographic, political economy and context in which they're designed, developed, and deployed. How does this manifest in your work in the communities or geographies where you work? And we'll start with Anita.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure and honor to be with all of you. When I grew up in school in Mumbai, I always dreaded being called out first because my name begins with an A. But I hope that I can make meaning and make sense in this initial interjection. Thank you very much for that initial framing, Gopal, and also to you, Samir, for pointing out the path dependency of technology. You know, it's indeed a very, very vital point. It's also important conceptually because we need to avoid tech essentialist readings. Technology and society are always in conversation, and I think this is something we need to remember. What I'll do is tell you two areas of practice of IT for Change, my organization, and to also underscore that a lot of our work takes on a distinct political economy orientation. So the questions of power that you pointed out, Gopal, are extremely central to the way we address our practice, our conceptualization, and also our policy work. So the first story is located in the context of commodification of education, the hollowing out of educational institutions, perhaps all over the world, but more so in India, particularly in the past 10 years, and the dubious business of EdTech, education technology. Some of you who are familiar with the context in India may be also familiar with Byju's, this EdTech company that became a household name during the pandemic. Byju's was founded in 2011, and by 2022, immediately after the pandemic, it was valued at $22 billion. But just after all of that, in April 2023, even as the company claimed to have over 150 million registered students, we started hearing innumerable stories of teachers who took up gigs on the platform, coming out with horror stories of exploitation. And Byju's suffered huge losses. That was because the venture capitalists pulled back and it laid off 500 employees. And just the last month, it filed for insolvency. This is, on the one side, the story of Byju's. The fact that it failed is not really important, but the fact that it really exploited society and children particularly is what's really important. The Indian education system is one of the largest in the world. We have more than 1.5 million schools, 8.5 million teachers, and 250 million children. But the stratification in access to education is staggering, which basically means that quality education is not available to the majority. 29% of kids, girls and boys, drop out of school before completing the full cycle of elementary education, and often they're the most marginalized children. Around 50% adolescents do not complete secondary education. I'm telling you all of this just to tell you that during the pandemic, when schools shut down, the learning loss was unimaginable. Children simply forgot. They forgot the alphabet, they forgot numbers. And this is when our organization set up the National Coalition on Education Emergency. Health emergency, everybody recognizes. But what's education emergency, right? We were going to work on the platformization of education, and we started systematically writing to state governments, subnational governments, taking them on one by one to challenge them on the private vendors, edtech companies that were being brought in, sometimes through the back door, often through the front door, with MOUs without any public debate. Many of us here have heard of the story of NHS in the UK and Palantir, right? But it was a very, very aware citizenry that pushed back. In our context, the very fact that these edtech companies were being brought in by governments to provide education was seen to be a very normal thing. These companies profile children based on their performance. They result in the de-skilling of teaching rather than promote teacher agency. And there's absolutely no due diligence. And Byju's, for instance, has a lot of household data. So we argued that governments have to be transparent about these MOUs, memorandum of understandings or agreements with private for-profit vendors. And this has been an ongoing kind of debate. I wouldn't say that the horizon is very close. I also want to say that our work with workers' data rights, mobilizing trade unions and civil society organizations to look at social security, to look at data rights has been extremely important, and what I would dare say is something that's extremely timely and meaningful. It's important to understand how platforms exploit the caste, class, and gender nexus in India. The reality of work in the global algorithmic order is very well documented now. We know that platforms extract value in the global south because our laws are very, very lax, our guarantees are minimal, and this is a labor squeeze, right? But what we found in our ethnographies in Bangalore, the city I come from, is the uphill task for workers who are all atomized to build solidarity. Paradoxically, however, where migrants live, the platforms send out supervisors to actually scout for people from the oppressed castes so that they can be recruited for stigmatized jobs. So who do they recruit? Very, very poor women belonging to oppressed castes who can clean toilets, right? So supervisory teams routinely onboard women, and platforms thus ascetize and appropriate embedded community in various ways, but they deny workers the basic right to build community. And this is something we've been working with unions on to enable them to understand the questions of dignity, community, solidarity, and how algorithmic workplaces follow the old markers. But it is important to note that the indignity here is much more intense. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Anita. So powerful. I want to hand it over to Barbara, and then also Barbara, just seeing if you had any kind of thoughts or reflections to what Anita was saying. Gopal, did you have something you want to chip in on?
No, I was trying to send a heart emoji.
Okay. Barbara, please come in.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this stellar panel this evening for me here in Uganda to speak about technology, especially from an agricultural perspective. I'd just like to start by saying that the development or deployment of any technology is always linked to the geopolitical context that Gopal talked about. And particularly in the realm of agriculture, the influence is on the global south. The technology that comes from the north is pushed down to the global south. I would like to just start by talking about the historical context and how these technologies were promoted in Africa. In 2006, the Gates Foundation and Rockefeller funded initiatives to promote green revolution technologies in Africa, including synthetic fertilizers and GMOs. And they promised that the adoption of these technologies would significantly improve the lives of Africans. It would double the yields and incomes of 30 million households by 2020. But by 2020, reports indicated that these technologies had not fulfilled their promises and were a massive failure. In Kenya, for example, maize yields declined, food insecurity rose during this period of the Green Revolution. And despite this failure, digitalization is heralded as a game changer for African agriculture. I'd like to say that while the digitalization is heralded as a game changer for agriculture, for African agriculture, it is often framed as a solution to the pressing challenges facing agriculture systems: high food insecurity, malnutrition, poverty, climate change, and all that is necessitated for agriculture transformation. And this has led to people like, philanthropists like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation lobbying governments and institutions to ensure that they promote digital technologies from that level. For example, the African Development Bank promotes digital technologies to modernize agriculture and integrate African farmers into global value chains. And they claim that these digital tools will provide African farmers with benefits like easy access to timely price and market and farming information. And this kind of digitalization has led to the competition of data from a host of technology corporations like Microsoft, Google, IBM, to the agriculture sector. Data is now a lucrative commodity. And in 2022, 45% of digital agriculture innovations from low and middle income countries were developed for Africa, with 666 active solutions. This means that most of the technologies that are coming from the West are being pushed down to us as Africans. But it's also important to note that the new and proprietary genetic engineering techniques also raise concerns about the privatization of genetic information, especially the digital sequence information from plants and wild species is increasing at a rapid pace because genetic information is now digitized into existing and new gene banks, giving rise to serious concerns about the illegal appropriation of traditional knowledge and privatization through patents. So this does not only benefit farmers, but they are using the farmers. Actually, they're going to expect farmers to pay proprietary products developed from their own genetic material and knowledge systems. Digitalization has also manifested in digital agriculture services. For example, Digital Green, which started in India and Ethiopia, is now in Nigeria, in Kenya, and Malawi, and several other countries. And platforms like Azure Data Manager for Agriculture, developed by Microsoft, implemented by Agra and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, offer digital services and data management for African smallholder farmers. These services are making sure that Western companies control the data and key data infrastructures and profit from both marketing services and reselling the farmers' data. It's important to note that this has manifested in several aspects of our work. And with the kind of broad discussion I've just painted there, many communities are now being forced to practice industrial agriculture, where these technologies are favoring commercial seeds and limiting crop diversity and leading to a reduction of indigenous and local varieties. Yet the majority of smallholder farmers in Africa do not need this technology, and it's definitely not developed for their interest. These digital technologies also have impact on biodiversity because the use of certified patent seed is reducing biological diversity and increasing dependence on external inputs. For example, hybrid seeds require repurchase every season. It decreases biodiversity and increases vulnerability to pests and climate changes. And yet, the African seed sector is still in the hands of small scale farmers. And so many studies have shown that 90% of the smallholder seed is accessed through informal systems. Digitalization has led to data exploitation, where the digital agriculture monetizes data about farmers' land and practices. It manipulates farmers' decisions and behavior, and this can be used for land grabbing. And digitalization of land governance and property rights has marginalized traditional and land tenure systems, favoring private interests and leading to new forms of dispossession of rural populations. And like Gopal said, digitalization in Africa has led to farmer de-skilling, where digital advisory services are de-skilling farmers, where traditional knowledge is lost and replacing skilled labor, and the dependence on patented seeds and industrial inputs are diminishing agricultural biodiversity. I'll stop there for now, but those were my thoughts for this prompt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Sasha, over to you.
Thank you. So the original question around the manifestation of basically technopolitics in the work and community or geography where we are. So I live and work in so-called Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is stolen native land of the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Pawtucket people. So I'm in the United States. I'm in the heart of empire, global neoliberal, capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal empire. And I'm in an area where there's a lot of universities, including the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, that plays a certain type of function in producing knowledge and workers and systems for the military industrial complex and for the corporate capitalist logistics networks. So a few miles from me, there's Kendall Square that has Google offices and Microsoft offices and a lot of biotech companies, many of which are developing some of the projects that Barbara was just talking about and figuring out how they're going to dominate agricultural markets as well as the data that's produced from small farmers. And so in the US context, we have extreme largely unchecked power from large technology companies. We have very light regulation. We've had a couple bright spots recently where we have some antitrust rulings that have been good against Google and some of the large tech companies. But by and large, we have support from both major parties for the ever-increasing growth of the big tech companies, who also come closer and closer to the military-industrial complex. So in the introduction, we heard about, some of the ways that the largest tech firms like Microsoft and Google and Amazon are working with the Israeli government and the Israeli military to produce automated systems to amplify the speed of genocide and attempt to reduce accountability. Systems like Project Nimbus, the cloud services for the Israeli military, or like the GoDaddy system, Where's Daddy, or others. So we're in a context of great algorithmic harm, growing surveillance, two major political parties that support the establishment of what we call cop cities all around the country. So training grounds for increasingly militarized police, hyper surveillance, and the use of digital tools of all kinds to track and target people both domestically and internationally. On the other hand, there's always resistance. Wherever there's power and inequality, there are people organizing and mobilizing. There are always social movements. And social movements, including in the US, are often hotbeds of socio-technical innovation. So in my first book called Out of the Shadows into the Streets, I wrote about how the immigrant rights movement in the United States leveraged what were then new technologies of social media, in particular MySpace, to organize and mobilize and successfully stop a right-wing anti-immigrant federal proposed bill called the Sensenbrenner Act. Of course, now since then we've had worse acts that have been put through and activated by both Republican and Democratic administrations, but we had powerful resistance that leverages these tools. We could talk about how Indie Media, or the Independent Media Center network, that was born at the end of the late 1990s into the early 2000s out of the anti-corporate ultra-globalization movement, really innovated and created what would later become social media, created video sharing platforms like transmission.cc or the Indie Media Video Distribution Network well before things like YouTube existed. Or we could talk about text message services like TextMob that were created by direct action activists to do end runs around police during big protests. And that tool became demo design for what would later become Twitter, which became an important tool during a certain period of time, for activists and networked movements to organize, kind of until the most recent chapter when it was purchased by the billionaire Elon Musk and turned into a cesspool of hate speech. So I know that we're running a little bit over on this one. So I just I'll share one quick story. So, here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we have all of this production of tech systems that reproduce algorithmic harm and are used for genocide and oppression, we also have a very active movement, especially led by students, in solidarity with, in particular right now, the Palestinian community. And so there's a company called Elbit Systems, and Elbit Systems is Israel's largest military contractor. They specialize in military electronics, surveillance, drones, security systems. They provide equipment for the apartheid wall in the West Bank. They provide killer drones that are used for war crimes and genocide in Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere. And Elbit also sells its experience in ghettoizing and killing Palestinians as quote unquote field tested technology. So people purchase these systems, and they're used in the US Mexico border wall. They're used in the repression of the Kashmiri people. They're used all over the world. But there's a campaign against Elbit Systems that's a transnational campaign. It was launched in 2007 as part of the Palestinian Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions National Committee. In 2009, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund divested, and that campaign has grown ever since. And just recently, a couple of weeks ago, which is why I'm sharing this story, here in Cambridge, we have been organizing and protesting and picketing outside the offices of Elbit Systems' local innovation office, which they strategically cited to try and attract talent from MIT and Harvard and other universities. And for almost a year, we've been picketing them. And a couple of weeks ago, they announced that they are closing their location and will be leaving Cambridge. So we forced them out. So that's just a little note that even here in the belly of the beast, in the heart of the United States, people are always organizing and mobilizing. And sometimes we have small victories against depressive tech systems.
Thank you so much, Sasha and Barbara and Anita, for your sharing there. And Sasha, you moved us wonderfully into the second prompt that we want you all to reflect on, which is the ways in which you yourself or movements that you're seeing or engaging with are building creative and generative policy, applications, campaigns, and practices around technology that build community power and self-determination. So recognizing that sometimes we see opportunities with the tools we don't control, but there's also the ways in which communities are developing and organizing to either gain control or develop technologies which they themselves do control, or utilizing some of these approaches. So I'm going to invite Barbara to go first, and then maybe Anita, and then maybe Sasha, and then Anita, just to change the order a little bit. So thank you. So Barbara.
Thank you so much, Gopal. And I just want to go straight into what I do at ETC. And part of what I do at ETC is that we are part of the Africa Technology Assessment Platform called AfriTAP. And AfriTAP really brings together African civil society groups, movements, independent scientists, lawyers, and other stakeholders who are working together to track and understand and assess the implications of new and emerging technologies in Africa. Essentially, what we really want AfriTAP to do is to enable Africans to choose their future pathway and assert control over new technologies and their continent's technological advancement. We want Africans to be part and parcel of the discussion of the technologies that are being brought onto the continent. So AfriTAP has been instrumental in Africa in terms of building capacity and sensitizing movements, leaders about digitalization in Africa and the forms that it's taking, especially with regard to agriculture, and raising awareness about the need to protect and preserve our indigenous knowledge. And through the African Working Group on Food and Agriculture, we find that several leaders and movements are now working to assess and look at the impact on biodiversity, on conservation, on food sovereignty, and other issues with a view of enabling social movements to organize together. We have convened several dialogues and built alliances between organizations. Right now, we've made alliances between AfriTAP and AFSA. AFSA is the African Food Sovereignty Alliance that's based here in Uganda, but works all over Africa, and Copagen in Western Africa. And now we are really advocating for the promotion of grassroots innovations and knowledge sharing, where we want grassroots innovation networks to network together, create solutions, because capitalism promotes the idea that we should wait for solutions. We believe that grassroots innovation enhances collaboration as a force to empower the community. AfriTAP also has been instrumental in really building a tech assessment framework. And tech assessment is really a range of practices used by people across the world to evaluate new and emerging technologies through a deliberate and systematic process. We envisage that this would be participatory, enabling people who are affected to come out and have expertise through their life experience, through diversity, the indigenous peoples, the farmers, the fisher folk, who are always left out of these discussions. So the aim of this technology assessment is really to look forward, to anticipate, to prevent damage before any new technologies are introduced. So we have planned a couple of technology assessments across Africa, especially in West and South and East, especially West and East Africa, where we intend to have a technology assessment on the implications of digitalization on food and farming systems in Africa. We are also looking into developing data cooperatives with agricultural cooperatives within East Africa and Africa in general. This is really about pulling individuals, organizations to aspire to become a united, jointly owned, democratically controlled autonomous association. And these cooperatives really evolve out of members' needs, but we feel that the data cooperatives will really help farmers to protect their data from being taken and being misused by the corporates who do not intend to protect who intend to profit from their data. The other aspect is that we're really looking at promoting data trusts. These are legal mechanisms to provide independent stewardship of data for two or more parties. They can state their interests, their needs, their expectations, and we hope that farmers will be given this leeway to protect and have the desired outcome for data use and mandates as a trustee to the aspirations of beneficiaries. So this right is held in trust, and as long as the trust meets the conditions that the farmers are really happy with. So this is what we are doing as part of AfriTAP, and we think that this kind of assessment will help farmers, will help local communities have more control over technology that's being deployed in Africa. And we are continuously discussing ways and means of how we can protect and promote the work that we do in Africa. I'll stop there.
Sasha, I'm going to invite you to go next.
Sure. So I think I'll say something briefly about the Design Justice Network, but then I want to talk about one project and AI Commons. So one of the hats I wear is I'm on the steering committee of the Design Justice Network, which is an international community of practice of people who are working to apply what are called the Design Justice Network principles that came out of the Allied Media Conference in Detroit. And there's a whole story that I could, kind of share about that. But instead, I think we just want, if someone could drop the link, designjustice.org. Thank you so much, Samir. And you can learn more about the Design Justice Network there. And I encourage people to get involved. That's a place where people are working together to co-create technologies whose design has truly been led by the experience and brilliance of people who are marginalized by interlocking systems of oppression. But I want to talk here a little bit about another hat I wear. I'm the head of research at One Project, which is a mission-driven nonprofit social venture working in partnership with others in the just transition ecosystem to build support and tools and systems for a just transition to a regenerative democratic economy. We play a couple different roles. We move resources where they're needed. We have a grant making program. We help build power and visibility for communities that are modeling just transition. And we also co-design shared infrastructure, like tools and systems and processes, including tech, to support a more just world. And recently, at one project, we worked with a number of collaborators to create some research about the potential for an AI commons. We haven't talked that much about the AI industry or the AI marketing hype cycle, however you want to frame it. But right now, what we're calling artificial intelligence is spearheaded by a handful of huge tech firms based in the global minority. They're all racing to outpace each other. They're turbocharging surveillance capitalism and digital colonialism and a monoculture of thought. And so most AI systems are being developed and deployed with a one model fits everything approach that tends to automate quality, be easily used to automate oppression and exclusion. It exacerbates the climate catastrophe. We talked about the energy consumption and water consumption needs. And so that's kind of the current situation. But recently, this research work with one project and with others, like Joana Varone and Mari Tamari and Vanessa Coates from Coding Rights in Brazil, and with Timnit Gebru from DARE, the Distributed AI Research Network, and others, we've been advocating for a shift to an AI commons ecosystem. And so a just transition requires a shift in AI development and deployment in the following ways. First, consensual data. So we have to switch from non-consensual data extraction, like Barbara was just talking about, to fully consensual, community-controlled data cooperatives and public data trusts in many different sectors. Second, we need fit-for-purpose models. So that means shifting from a monoculture of you build one giant large language model by throwing the whole internet at it, to small and specific and fit-for-purpose models. And Timnit Gebru has been published a paper with others about language models that function better for translation into less used African languages when you carefully curate the data set and focus on that task instead of just putting everything in. We need dignified data work. So we have to shift from exploitative ghost work to dignified, appropriately compensated and recognized data work, possibly in data worker cooperatives. And I know that there's some great work happening in Kenya around that. We need to shift from extreme concentration of this industry in the handful of global minority big tech firms, and instead imagine a flourishing ecosystem of small and local global majority based firms and cooperatives and public entities and networked initiatives. We also have to bring accountability in, so a shift from automated inequality to harm reduction and accountability for everyone who's developing and deploying and using these harmful systems. And of course, we have to think about an ecological evolution away from massive resource consumption, energy and water use, and cobalt and precious metals use that are the mining is being done in horrific conditions that are also part of genocidal activity in Congo and Sudan, and shift away to a smaller footprint, a focus on developing renewable materials, and increased sensitivity to our relationship with the earth and all her inhabitants.
And I'll invite you, Anita, to share your reflections as well.
Thank you so much. I think the question about, what are the ways we can build a creative technology? How do we restore power and self-determination to communities is a very important question. It's also important because there's so much totalizing, dystopic storytelling around digital technologies, around AI, as Sasha pointed out. And therefore, we must keep the stories of resistance alive and create mythology, I think, mythologies that we can hold on to. But one thing that cannot be forgotten is the rise of the power of transnational, of the entity, of the creature, the beast, called the transnational corporation. And, as Barbara pointed out, what's really happening to traditional systems of knowledge and the ways in which production is organized in our parts of the world is that big tech is displacing the traditional forms of knowing and being. And therefore, actually, there is a kind of, destiny by technology, right? Why is this? Partly the reason is that for the first time ever, we actually have a technological apparatus, which is at the same time, both the means of production, which is AI, for instance, the farmers that Barbara spoke about using predictive technologies or drones, and at the same time, the technology as a means of communication. So we see a fusion of the means of production and the means of communication. And this materiality of digital technologies is very, very different from the historical materialities of, let's say, the printing press or electricity or anything else. And therefore, the trajectories of techno-feudalism that we are witness to today is pretty unprecedented in history. One critical part about this is that it is ruthless about social memory. It erases social memory, which is why within one generation, farmers who knew how to cultivate through traditional means can forget entirely what it means to do such cultivation, such organic cultivation, such natural farming. I see workers in data value chains not really know that there is an alternative. They see precarity as naturalized. So they think that to be part of the gig labor chain is normal. So in some way, I think what the current technological orchestration under capitalism is doing is that it is totally erasing a certain social embedding. And the work of ETC shows that extractivism is not just on land, it's also in the oceans, it is in space. So how do we then start thinking creatively about local alternatives? Because it's paralyzing. And, all of us know the story. As they say in my part of the world, you can wake up someone who's sleeping, but you cannot wake up someone who's pretending to sleep, right? So I think that some of the solutions that were spoken about, the norms and principles that Sasha was talking about is, become very, very important. It's increasingly clear that the logic of the black box, right, where things are completely inscrutable, is not really necessary. Oftentimes we were told that deep learning is, it's so magical that it can produce accurate results, that it's not flawed. But we are now realizing that there's no evidence to show that interpretability or explainability diminishes accuracy. Why do we need accuracy? We have human systems waiting there to make decisions, right? So we are working on a very simple elementary model, which we call the public AI program. And I'll come shortly to also complementing what Sasha spoke about in terms of the commons, to saying that very often in the global south, in developing countries, we need public intervention. We also need public AI, public data. We need, which is a complement to the commons, right? So we are doing a program where student learning of English and other languages is supported through a very simple elementary audio storytelling repository that runs off a FOSS app, which is called Antenna Pod. And we build algorithms to understand student language production in order to support teachers to make appropriate pedagogic decisions. The code is open, the data is locally managed, and the application runs on the systems in the school. It's entirely decentralized. So we are talking anti-scale, right? So I just want to conclude by saying that we need the courage to go beyond, do no harm. I think time has come for civil society, for social movements to recognize that our ask from policymakers, our ask from industry is to go beyond, do no harm. The key is to rebuild meso-level interventions so that the macro norms, rules, principles can be complemented by investing in smaller institutions for farmers, for students, for teachers, for fishers, for cooperatives, right? So what we really need is to distribute the power of technology through the building of something that can bring public value. And I'm talking about public goods or public infrastructures. The commons can thrive on top of public infrastructures, right? And without these investments in public value creation, the global south cannot build what Silicon Valley managed to build over 3 decades. So I think the future of humanity hinges on the discovery and practice of a new political economic paradigm based on the commons, yes, but scaffolded by the public. So a paradigm where critical human consciousness can be complemented by machine intelligence to forge a new sensibility of dignity. What does it mean to have dignity when I'm embracing technology? So this is a new age care ethics of society and economy. And we need to think about alliances in very, very creative ways. And that's what we are setting out to do with a few organizations, setting up the Center for Global Digital Justice. I can talk about it some other time. But I want to point you to some of the work that IT for Change has done, in the Global South-led idiom. During the pandemic, we got out this collection of brilliant essays called the Digital New Deal, and I'll plug that soon in the chat. We also got out a kind of a flagship product called the State of Big Tech. And this year, the State of Big Tech is going to be on the spaces and places of AI, to trace back the spaces and places of AI. I would also recommend that you look up Bot Populi, just like Vox Populi. Bot Populi is technology for the people, and our periodic monthly newsletter, which is called Data Sin, spelled with a SYN, which is a pun on sin, big tech sins versus people's synergies. So these are some of the things I really wanted to place in front of you as active interventions with alliances and social movements. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anita. And thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Sasha. We're gonna kind of move to closing reflections and kind of give some space and also check in on some questions that were put in the Q&A box. Again, encourage questions. I think you go, Paul, to be addressed in there. So I just wanted to open it up for anything else to add, any reflections or responses on what you heard from others that were said here. And I'll start off with Sasha.
Oh my goodness, I wish we had like a whole nother hour to just keep talking and get lots more conversation going. But what's coming to mind for me right now, I really agree with everything that you said, Anita. I think I want to spend just a couple minutes maybe talking about, like, let's puncture and deflate a little bit the mythology of the totalizing mythology of artificial intelligence as a dramatic departure from the history of capitalist technological production. I agree that there are some things that are new, and I don't think we should overemphasize the newness because it can be overwhelming and disempowering. And so, what's happening here is the same thing that's been happening for hundreds of years under capitalist settler colonialism and exploitation of bodies and lands and knowledge. What we call AI right now is mostly based on theft. So the large language models that are, fueling the hype cycle with things like, ChatGPT and OpenAI, or so-called generative AI systems that can produce, images and so on. So first of all, these systems aren't intelligent. It's a misnomer. This is just math. I think it might be Kathy O'Neill. I don't want to misquote it, but who just says, whenever you hear AI, just say mathy math. There's some complicated math happening. And then there's these giant data sets that are basically stolen intellectual labor from all of the knowledge that's been gathered and placed on the internet, which doesn't reflect all of the world's knowledge. It reflects a small minority of the world's knowledge, but it's a lot of stuff there. And it's basically being stolen, and there's thievery happening. And then mathy math is used to train models that can produce rough approximations or predictive completion of sentences or of prompts for images. So it's kind of like a giant autocorrect system. It spits back out. You could also think of it as a plagiarism machine. Minor variations on texts that it's been trained upon. There are certain contexts in which it's useful. I use these tools a little bit, but I think we need to demystify them. So I think we need to learn about how these systems work, learn about the ways that they've been created through the privatization of what Marx would have called the general intellect, and its privatization in hands of a few multinational companies that then get to profit off of the collective fruits of human knowledge and labor. And we have great tools to fight them already. So we can use antitrust and monopoly cases. That's already happening in a number of places. In the US, we recently have a pretty great ruling, an anti-monopoly ruling against Google. We can use IP cases. Like there's a whole bunch of, it's funny because I've in the past have been quite maximalist in my maximalist opponent to so-called intellectual property. However, we have some tools that we can use to fight these companies, and that's happening now. So, for example, musicians and authors are suing giant tech companies for stealing their work without consent or compensation, and using it to train these models. And we have all of the possibilities of building alternatives. And we've already talked about, digital public infrastructure, public initiatives, which could be, state-based, could also, these can happen at the municipal level. You can have municipal, data cooperatives. You can have them at the level of the firm or the community. So at every scale, we have already people experimenting with many alternative possibilities and building tools that are fit for purpose instead of just relying on these huge companies like the system that Anita was talking about to support language learning that's locally hosted and run in schools. And everywhere you look, there are projects like that, popping off. And so I think that we should fight against the unchecked power of these mega companies, but we also shouldn't despair because they're not all powerful and they don't have, special access to some quote unquote, some mythological intelligence. They're just stealing our data and selling it back to us and taking public money to do it. So we should fight to redirect that public money to healthier and less harmful and more consentful and joyful alternatives.
Thanks, Sasha. Anita, any reflections or responses that you have?
Yeah. I think that positionality is important, and I certainly am not the type to despair. And I also think that what history has taught us is, much as forces of oppression may reinvent themselves, resistance always has the last laugh. But I also think that we must understand that in the context of imperial power, the whole neo-colonization that has happened over this data theft is not really a kind of a solitary building block, right? It is building on top of traditional power structures in the international political economy. So what am I saying in all of this jargon? I'm saying that traditional trade rules, for instance, if you look at bilateral trade relationships or regional trade agreements, the way in which developing countries are forced to sign on the dotted line is to say, if you transfer technology, then you're free to take away my data. And do developing countries need trade? Of course they do. Otherwise, you will end up like all those countries which have embargoes, right? Because they're different from capitalist countries. So in the pragmatics of reality is also intellectual property, and not quite in the same way where authorial rights of artists and indigenous people operate. I'm talking about trade secrets where an entire bunch of data taken away from developing countries is locked up by private enclosures of companies in the name of trade secrets, which means that I don't have access to that data to build my own innovation. And this is real political economy. So, I mean, I could go on. I could also talk about digital taxation. Google will listen to the fines imposed by the European Union, but not the Competition Commission of India, right? So, I mean, I really think that the bargaining power of different actors in the global stage and the entire phenomenon of digital is very global, right? In some ways, the digital and data don't care about borders, right? So I think really it's important to appreciate the task at hand to dismantle. We cannot be, I think, somewhat, it's not fun. I think it is really, really, I mean, formidable, because the way in which the kind of crystallization of power happens over traditional power structures is something that places extraordinary duress on the social movements of the global south. So what do you do when the last of your cultivable plot has been taken over by AI, right? So it's a crisis of an order where I think while we don't have to over-valorize the corporation, we can actually thumb our noses at these corporations. We really have to recognize that our own states, our own governments in the global stage do not care about people's sovereignty. So you're caught really between the devil of the international political economy of data and digital and the deep sea of our own governments, which are not really able to represent our interests, the interests of the people on the global stage. So it's rather different from the United States. And even in the United States, I may beg to differ that despite all the Supreme Court cases, big tech is not listening. Big tech is very busy at this point influencing the United Nations on the Summit of the Future outcomes, where we must remember that the absence of a democratic governance system, an accountable system of rules, which is present in the climate area, it's present in the genetics area, with all its imperfections, we lack a global compact, we lack a kind of a global set of rules, binding rules, in the area of the digital. And this, I think, is a vacuum that big tech uses to its advantage.
Thank you so much, Anita. We're going to shift to Barbara for reflections, and then I've also asked Barbara to respond to Ali's question about technology implications for Africa.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to reiterate Sasha's stance about AI and saying that AI is basically stealing of our data, and they steal from us to sell back to us. And I think that's what's really happening in Africa. And I just wanted us to reflect a little bit about technology. We have the power to design, to create and implement technologies since time immemorial. Communities everywhere have been more than capable to innovate. And all of a sudden now, high-tech products are becoming more, are being graded more as innovations to us. And yet the innovations that have been, stuck with us as Africans since time immemorial is really being taken away from us. So I just wanted to answer Ali's question about certain technologies destroying the values of solidarity. Yes, I think that Africans, we are slowly losing the power to innovate, because most of these tech companies are coming with new technologies, which is taking us away from our traditional technologies that we've known since time immemorial. And we are trying to assess and come up with new ideas of things that we've not learned since time immemorial. So I think that we really need to go back to the drawing board and say, what kind of technology are we looking at? We're looking at technology that is local. We're looking at technology, for example, that is farmer-centric, that is adaptive to culture, and it's adaptive to our local context. We're looking at technology where farmers have control over data, have control over data, and they have the reason they have they can engage with this technology because they have been used to it and they are part of the development and deployment of this technology. What's happening now is that we have a top-down kind of arrangement where, like Sasha and Anita have alluded, that most of the technology that's coming down to Africa is already being pushed down to us, to take over. But I think we need to ask ourselves how to ensure that technology that should be developed should be equitable. It should, it should be responsive to the needs of the people who are going to use it. And we need to start to ask these questions. Who decided that we need this technology? Who designed it? Who owns the intellectual property rights? Who profits from this technology? And I'll also ask that we should start, I don't know if you have read, I'd urge all of you to read The Politics of Technology by the ETC group. It really interrogates and explores key assumptions about why we hold about technology, and unpacks the intentions behind technologies and the ways that we can control technology. So I feel that we need to go back to the drawing board. We need to allow communities to innovate, and us in the social movements have the power to start to talk to local leaders, to start to think about data cooperatives, to start to think about data trusts, where we can protect the data of our farmers. But in addition to that, we can protect and promote our traditional indigenous knowledge that we've held for so many years. I want to stop there. Thank you, Gopal. Sorry, thank you, Samir.
Thank you all. And I think Sasha's sentiments about needing and wanting more time to discuss this, a very purposefully complicated topic. And we know how political and industrial power purposefully complicates systems and practices to reduce transparency around how we interrogate them. There's a couple of just points I want to use, maybe a facilitator's prerogative, just to add and bring back to some previous things that were said. In addition to the data economy, there is just tremendous infrastructure, the hardware that is required. And we heard about the energy and the water consumption. We heard about the enormous amounts of minerals and material extraction and usage. There's analysis that's saying that the requirement for all that is supposedly projected around the digital economy and the artificial intelligence economy is going to replace extraction for oil. It's just one for the other. There is land theft and land grabs that are happening for the data centers in North America, in the US, and also across the planet. And there's the labor that's involved in laying the cables that is actually completely erased and poorly compensated, and all of the issues around wage conditions and theft. And then there is this inevitability that we talk about. And I want to just bring back that there is an inevitability around the fossil fuel economy. There's an inevitability around genetically modified organisms for agriculture. With these types of hype technologies in whatever sector we talk about, there is this type of economic evolution that we ignore. We have transitions, we have transformations, and we're not in this session and from this perspective saying that we have to eradicate all technological development or we have to reduce, any sort of quote unquote progress, but we have to interrogate, what do we mean by progress? How can we actually build new technologies and economies with free prior informed consent for indigenous and traditional communities through this varied existing applications that are building community power and community self-determination, some of which we heard from Anita and the resistance forms that we heard from Sasha. So there's a whole variety of directions that we can move down, and we can engage in economic development, economic evolution, community evolution and development for a liberatory stance. Nothing is inevitable from that perspective. And again, that's the prerogative and the messaging of how power exerts itself, and saying that this is all inevitable when it's not in reality. So we have to use the methods that we've heard about here to really move in the direction that is for us and by us, as we've heard in movement languages, in so many languages across the world. So again, I want to thank my comrade Gopal for his support on this, our speakers, Anita Gurumurthy, Sasha Costanza-Chak, Barbara Ntambirweki, our language justice team for the translation of very jargony delivery and topics here today, Isaac from Movement Generation for the tech support. And I also want to just highlight our next seminar, which will be the final one for the year, which is focusing on joy and grief and movement and community power building, and how we have to make space for expressions in both in this work that all of you are engaged in. And that'll be on November 12th. Thank you all so much, and we'll end it there.